I was talking in Washington, D.C. some years ago, and I could make the statement that it was 100% effective, and Lester Blumenthal called me to his office. Oh, really, he called me, asked me if I'd have lunch with him. We had lunch, and he says, you know, Dave, you should never make that statement about anything being 100% effective because there's no such thing in medicine. And I said, I never made any such statement as that. He says, well, you certainly did. Last night you said you'd been 100% effective with impotence cases. And I said, well, I have. That doesn't say that my doctors are going to be as successful as I have been. And he says, you know, I think you've only had easy ones to solve. You've never had the tough ones like we have to solve in our offices. And I said, oh, now, wait a minute, doctor. You're a student of mine, and you're an awfully good student of mine. Do you think that you would call me into your office on an easy case? Wouldn't you be able to handle that yourself? He says, yes, but anyhow, I don't think you've hit the really tough ones. If you hit the kind of cases that I encounter in my office, I know you'd come a cropper. So I said, all right, I'll tell you how I feel about it. You make an appointment with the toughest case of impotence you have in your office, and I'll show you that I don't fail with those things. So he made an appointment, and I went over to his office, and he had a tape recorder, and he says, do you mind if I set the tape recorder going? I said, no. If I succeed, you'll have it on record, and if I don't succeed, you'll also have it on record. So go ahead, let's try it. Now, the case he had come in that day was a man who was a suicidal depressive. And now this is the way I feel about impotence. Impotence expresses the will to die. Potency expresses the will to live. And once I knew that he had the will to die, it was easy to see where the impotence came from. Because you have no desire to procreate when you have the will to die. So all I had to do was to find out what caused the will to die. Well, this was fairly easy. There were quite a number of family problems in there, financial difficulties and so on. And it took, I would say, maybe 15 or 20 minutes to get to the basic cause of the will to die. Now, I've told you the way in which you get rid of the will to die and change it to the will to live. And once I had succeeded in changing his will to die to the will to live, then I gave him suggestions for potency. I told him that as your will to live increases, your potency will increase. With the result that 2 months later, Dr. Blumenthal was able to say that that man's potency was completely restored and that his will to die had completely vanished. We were sufficiently successful with impotence cases so that we quickly could see that there are two kinds of impotence. One where the cause is known, two where the cause isn't known. And where the cause isn't known, you are not apt to be successful with superficial suggestion. If you are, the relief only lasts for a couple of weeks and then the man is impotent again. But when you get down to the cause and bring out the cause and expose the cause so that he can understand it completely, then his potency seems to be completely restored. For example, in the case of the two men that I told you about, I happened to be in the doctor's home a year or two ago, and I said to him, have they ever lost their potency? And he says, Dave, those men haven't got through thanking me yet. He says, I still see them. They have completely restored potency. I want you to know that you can depend upon this information 100%. Do hypnoanalysis in those cases where you don't know the cause of the impotence, and you don't have to do hypnoanalysis where you do know the cause of the impotence. And in both cases, you'll find yourself remarkably successful with that type of case. Now, the men began to ask, well, if it works so well for impotence, why shouldn't it work equally well for frigidity? I've never been as successful with frigidity problems as I have been with impotence problems. And I think the reason is manifest. When you are talking to a man on such a problem, the man doesn't hesitate to come clean. He'll tell you everything that's on his mind. If he's got any hidden thoughts or anything like that, he'll come out, he'll tell you them. But when you're dealing with a woman, a man dealing with a woman, and you may be dealing with a very fine, splendid example of womanhood, a woman who's been brought up tenderly and reared very carefully and so on, when you talk to her on so intimate a problem as sex, and sex in its most intimate manifestations, she can't talk to you as she would talk to perhaps another woman. She'll hold back. And so I would say this, that when it comes to impotence in a man, I would expect to be successful in 10 out of 10 cases. And I would expect my students to be successful in about 8 out of 10 cases. When it comes to frigidity, I would say that in 10 cases, I would be completely successful with 5 or 6, partially successful with about 1 or 2 more, and fail with the others, but badly. But there's the explanation for it, and I'm sure this is so. In fact, I have said to women doctors who are in my classes, you know, doctor, if you interested yourself in this subject of frigidity, a woman could talk to you, and maybe where she wouldn't reveal the real problem to me, she would to you, and you would probably establish as high a record as I have been able to establish dealing with men on what is relatively the same subject. They'll come clean, they'll tell you what their problem is, and the instant they tell you what their problem is, if the cause is known at conscious level, all you have to do is to give them suggestions that they won't be frigid anymore. And the chances are about 99 out of 100 that they will accept your suggestions. And even the woman who has never known what a complete union is will enjoy a complete union, and she will never go frigid again. On the other hand, where the cause is not known at conscious level, then you must do hypnoanalysis. And you would be surprised what these hypnoanalyses on such women reveal. You probably think that frigidity isn't too common. A good-looking doctor will tell you that there's no such thing as frigidity in women. Why? I don't meet a case like that in all my professional career. But you meet a man, we'll say around my age, who's been in practice for quite a number of years. And if he deals with the subject at all, he'll tell you that it is one of the things that is a constant source of worry to him in his profession, and that he meets such cases again and again all year through. How many doctors meet such cases all the year through? You do, and you look at that. My gosh, you see how many. And the funny thing is, when in some class, a handsome 6-footer, you know, very much the He-Man type, will say, oh, Mr. Elwin, I've been in practice 10 years and I've never had a frigidity case as long as I've been in practice. You should hear the hoot of laughter that comes from the other men in class, because every man in class has had many, many, many such cases. Now, how do you handle such cases? In the first place, you must handle them with a finesse that is superb. Remember, you're talking to a woman on a very intimate subject. Therefore, you never use common words in talking to her about such problems. You never even use words that are in common usage. For example, I can talk to a woman on the most intimate subject on earth and never use such a common expression as intercourse. I think that's vile, because it has come into common usage and no longer has the scientific, the medical connotation that it had, we'll say, 50 years ago. Today, it's a brutal-looking thing. The teenage kids use the expression. So I don't use words like that. I use words like union, in union with your husband. And in expressing anything, stay away from all common words. You'll find then that their sensibilities are not affected. How do you approach such a woman? The doctor dealing with such a subject has to use tact to avoid self-involvement. He can't be seeming to get a vicarious thrill out of hearing some woman's sexual problems. Therefore, he must hold himself aloof from all thinking, which would have the woman feel that he's enjoying this trying work. And when I tell you that it is trying work, it is trying work, gentlemen. It is trying work. Let me give you the type of case history which will let you know how a case of this type is handled. For it must be handled in a certain deft way, otherwise you will fail terribly with it. Here's how I became involved in this work. When these doctors began calling me up for impotence problems, and they began to see that the technique of hypnoanalysis would solve these impotence problems so readily, pretty soon they began to call me in on problems of frigidity. For when they found out that their suggestions given at surface level had no effect whatsoever on certain cases, then they'd call up and say, well, how come I gave suggestions to Mrs. Yifnif and she's just as frigid as ever? Then they would call me over to their offices, and having made an appointment with Mrs. Yifnif, and I would work with Mrs. Yifnif for half an hour. Then I'd work with Mrs. Jones for half an hour. Then Mrs. Smith for half an hour. And then I'd go from one doctor's office to another, working with these cases. And so when I say that I encountered many of these cases, and can tell you thousands of instances where the technique has been successful, I'm only being truthful in what I say. Now, let me give you a fair example of the type of case which is fairly difficult to handle. It got so that the doctors used to save up these cases for me, 3 and 4 at a time. And one of these doctors who was in the habit of doing that called me up one day and he says, Dave, have you ever tried to remove frigidity on a woman approaching her 70th birthday? And I said, Doctor, I haven't the slightest idea about anything like that. I don't know whether it could be done or whether it couldn't be done. He said, well, would you like to try it? And I said, why? What makes you ask, Doctor? Well, he says, I've got the strangest case at the hospital. I've had that woman in the hospital for 2 weeks, undergoing every type of test that you can possibly put a human body through. We can't find a thing organically the matter with her, but she has every neurotic symptom that you could shake a stick at. So many neurotic symptoms, Dave, that the woman is in agony. I feel that it's sexual tension doing it, or that sexual tension is causing a lot of it. And I'll tell you why I think that. Talking to her reveals the fact that she has 4 children and 14 grandchildren. Some such number, I don't care. I don't know if the number is correct, I forgot. But anyhow, she had some children, she had quite a lot of grandchildren. I do remember that. And he says, and in talking to her, I found out that she doesn't even know what a climax is. She doesn't even have the slightest idea what an orgasm is. She doesn't know anything about it. All she knows is that sex is a horrible thing and that you have to do it to have babies. And she's resented it all her lifetime. So I said, well, Doctor, I've never worked on anybody that old. I don't know whether I'd be successful on that one or not. But I said, if you feel that it's worth a try, I'd be glad to try with you. An appointment was set up at my house. The doctor brings the wife and the husband over to my house, and this is my approach. And this is the approach that I think any doctor could use. And like myself, who has handled over 4,000 sexual problems of all types, I have never known a woman to resent this approach. For in all the cases I have ever worked with of this type, not one has ever said, no, I don't want to go through with it after I make this approach. After the doctor had introduced the wife and her husband, then I said, Mrs. Jones, your doctor's brought you over here on something very, very important. He wants me to discuss with you the problem of frigidity. That means I must talk to you on a very intimate basis. Perhaps more intimately than any man has ever talked to you in his life, including your husband. Now, if I have to do that on a personal basis, I'd be embarrassed. I know for certain you'd be embarrassed. And we just wouldn't get to first base, because I couldn't ask you the questions I should ask you, and you couldn't give me the answers you should give me. Therefore, we can't do it on a personal basis. We've got to do it on an impersonal basis. If you can look on me as a table, a chair, a picture on the wall, a lamp, anything, just a piece of furniture, a voice coming to you out of the nowhere. If you could look on me absolutely impersonally, so that any question I ask of you, or anything I say to you, seems to be just a voice coming from nowhere, then I could talk to you personally on an impersonal basis, and you could answer me personally on an impersonal basis. Then you wouldn't be embarrassed, and I wouldn't be embarrassed, and we might be able to get someplace. But if it has to be on any other basis than that, I'm afraid I'd rather not begin. Do you think you can do it? I guess so. I don't know. The doctor brought me over here for that purpose, and I guess I can. I can try anyhow. Then I turned to her husband, and I said, "You've heard what I've said to your wife, and let me repeat. I'll have to talk to her personally, intimately. More intimately, perhaps, than you have ever talked to her in your entire life, and you are her husband. If you have any objections, or if she has any objections, I'd rather not start. What is your answer?" "Well, the doctor brought her over here for that purpose, and I guess if she can take it, I certainly shouldn't stand in the way. I guess I could take it all right." I said, "You won't be there, you understand that?" And he said, "Yeah, I understand." I said, "Okay." Then I turned to her doctor, and I said, "Doctor, we still don't have to go ahead. I want to be absolutely 100% sold that you believe your patient can take it, because I don't want to get into this thing unless you feel that she can take it, and unless you feel that the way I talk, and you know the way I talk in these situations, unless it's okay with you. It's got to be okay with all three of you before I'm ready to start." So he said, "Dave, I brought her over here for that purpose, and I feel certain that it's our only chance. Let's try." So we had the husband sit downstairs. The wife and the doctor and I went upstairs to a bedroom. And as we opened the door, she said, "I know what caused this whole thing." And I said, "What caused?" She said, "I was raped when I was 8 years old." "Did you ever tell your mother?" "No." "Did you ever tell your dad?" "No." "Did you ever tell your husband?" "No. Nobody in the world. You're the only two people ever knew about it until now." You see, there was the cause, partly known at conscious level. Anyhow, I had her lie down on the bed, and I put her into somnambulism. Now, I must tell you exactly the way the doctor and I work. I make the doctor sit next to me about 3 or 4 feet away from the bed, or the couch, or whatever it is. If it's in his office, it's the examining table, it's got to be 4 feet away, 3 or 4 feet away, so that there's no chance of the woman thinking that we're coming near her, or that we're getting any thrill, any vicarious thrill out of the intimacies which she reveals. It just is kept circumspect, and I won't let the doctor move from the seat, and I won't move from the seat until we are both ready to leave at once. Now, after putting her into somnambulism, then I proceeded as follows. I took her back to her earliest sexual experiences, found out she was quite normal at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. At the age of 8, I find that she comes out in the yard to play. And there's a building going up across the street, and 2 kids are playing in the basement. And they signal her, "Come on over, Mary, come on over and play." And this little 8-year-old, absolutely unsuspecting that anything was wrong, went over there to play. The 2 little kids held her down, while a 16-year-old boy actually raped her. Now, I know it was rape because the doctor and I saw the abreaction, and the abreaction was violent. And it was true rape. And she was bleeding and all that sort of stuff. In the middle of the ab reaction, I said to her, why don't you go across the street and tell your mother? She'd kill me. She'd think it was my fault. Why don't you tell your dad? He'd really kill me. Why don't you go to the police? That's against the law. They'd think it was my fault. This poor little kid, you could see that she had run up against a situation with which she couldn't cope. After we'd seen enough of the ab reaction to feel certain that it had done the patient a lot of good, and that she was getting this poison out of her system, once she got the poison out of her system, we stopped the ab reaction, and an ab reaction is stopped in a very simple way. You merely change the tense. Instead of saying, what happens now, you say, what happened then? And immediately, instead of ab-reacting, the person is recalling. It's a simple device, and it seems to me so darn silly that no psychiatrist has ever apparently realized this. And psychiatrists say, how do you end an ab-reaction like that? We don't know what to do, they say. If they knew hypnosis, they'd know what to do. You merely change tense, and you end the ab-reaction. So I changed tense, ended the ab reaction, and after I ended the ab reaction, I said, now let's bring you back to today. Now you tell me why you're frigid. She says, I know. I said, of course you knew. You knew all the time. She said, every time my husband comes near me, I see in him the boy who raped me. I said, of course, he represents the rape figure to you. And it's no wonder that you've been frigid all these years. It's no wonder that you could never reach a culmination in the sexual act. The sexual act just seemed dirty and filthy to you simply because of this unpleasant experience that you had when you were 8 years old. Now look, there's your husband downstairs. He's been true to you. He's been loving you for 35 years or more. I guess they've been married at least that long. I forget how many years they've been married. Anyhow, I said all these years, he's been loyal to you. He's been true to you. Right now, he's sufficiently interested in your problem so that he's standing by, waiting, hoping that you will have recovered from this situation which you've had all these years. Now, I said, you don't have to see him as the rape figure anymore. You can see him for what he really is, the man who loves you, and the man who's loved you devotedly all these years, the father of your children, the man who was grandfather with you over quite a number of children. And he's a pretty wonderful guy, isn't he? Oh, the best, she said. So you don't have to see him as the rape figure anymore. She said, but I could never enjoy sex. I don't even know what any part of it is like. Every part of it seems horrible to me. I've never even had a climax. I don't know what it's like. So I said, well, we can fix that very easily. You have children. And remember when those children were about 6 months old, how each one of them began playing with his hands, or her hands? Yes. And then when they got to be about 8 or 9 months old, they started playing with their feet? He says, yes. I said, when they got to be about a year old, they touched themselves in private places. They discovered that they had other body parts. Do you remember that? She says, yes, every child does that. I said, then your children did. She said, of course they did. I said, then for a few years, they forget that they have body parts. And then they rediscover that they have body parts, but this time they discover that certain body parts have a seat of pleasure. Did your children do that? She says, of course, every child does that. I said, then you must have done that. She says, of course. I said, all right, I'm going to take you back to the day when you first discovered that you had a seat of pleasure. When I snap my fingers, you'll be right there discovering it. I snapped my fingers and said, where are you? And she said, in the living room. I said, what are you doing? She says, I'm rubbing up against a chair. I said, all right, continue to rub up against the chair, and the doctor and I will leave the room. Now, you're a grown woman now. You're not a little 3 or 4-year-old child. Nature has a peculiar faculty. If, as an adult, you will keep your mind fastened to an incident like that which occurred in childhood, nature will be able to take you through a complete cycle, including something you've never known before, an orgasm. The doctor and I will walk out of the room, and when you've gone through the complete cycle, just call us back into the room. Then the doctor and I got up and left the room. When we got out of the room, I can remember standing there in the hallway as the doctor said to me, Dave, she's 70 years old. Do you think she's going to take that suggestion? I said, I don't know, doctor. You know that a lot of other women have taken it. He says, yes, I know, but gee, we've never tried it with anybody near this age. I said, I know. And I don't know any more than you do what's going to happen, but she's human. Just about that time, we heard her crying out in a voice of absolute rapture, Joe, Joe. Well, Joe was the name of the man who was downstairs. That was her husband. So he said, my God, Dave, it's working. I said, yeah, it is working. And I said, I had a hunch it would work. She's human, and if she's human, she should respond to suggestion. About 2 or 3 minutes later, she calls us back into the room. She's sitting up in bed. Her face is absolutely radiant. And the tears are streaming down her face. I'll never forget the way she looked. And as she came in, she says, oh, doctor, Mr. Hellman, have I just misunderstood sex all my life? You mean it can be something wonderful, something so thrilling, something so beautiful, and I've always thought it was ugly and terrible and dirty and everything. Yes, but you don't have to think that anymore. So we had her lie down again, put her into deep somnambulism once more, and this time gave her the suggestion that every time she was in union, she would be able to go through a complete union with her husband, including the things she had just experienced. A complete cycle. After we'd convinced her that this was possible and would happen, we then roused her, sent her and her husband home, and the doctor and I stayed there talking about the case for a while. 2 months later, the doctor reported to me as follows on this case. He says, no, Dave, we did not get a complete cure in this case. He says, what we did get was just this. When she's has no emotional upsets, when everything is going normally, and she and her husband attempt union, she can go through a complete cycle and does go through a complete cycle. However, should she be emotionally disturbed at the time that he approaches her, she still sees in him the rape figure. I said, yes, doctor, and that indicates you'll have to do more work with her. He says, yes, I know that. But he says, here's the thing wherein we did succeed 100%. Every neurotic symptom that she had when she was in the hospital has completely disappeared since the night that we corrected the frigidity. Now, that's the way a frigidity case is handled. And I know that implies that you must talk so intimately to a person. And let me just say this to the doctors here, that there are many doctors hearing me who say to themselves, oh, I could never talk like that to a woman. I don't know how I would start talking about such a subject. I'd say the wrong thing. I'd upset the apple cart. It's just unpleasant. I'd rather not do it. Gentlemen, I'm not saying that you have to do it, but I do say this much about it, that first and foremost you are doctors. And you've got to put your personal feelings aside, it seems to me. There's many unpleasant chores that you have to do in medicine. This is perhaps one of them. And if it seems like an unpleasant chore to you, all I can say to you is that the health of the patient comes first and should always come first in the doctor's mind. And beyond that, I can't say anything more to you. If you don't want to do it, that's up to you entirely. But when you refuse to do it, refuse to give a woman help that she is needing, and you're one of the few people on earth who know how to give her that help, well, I don't know. I think you ought to think twice before you turn down the opportunity to help such a person. Think of it the way I think about it. I think that when you get a person rid of any type of symptom, any type of condition which is detrimental to them, you're adding to their length of life. I'm sure of that, and I'm sure we're right in that thinking.